Welcome to the 13th episode of The Right Cast. And of course, I know you are smiling already, Anthony, because you know what I'm about to say. Of course, it's episode 13. That is why I look like I am straight out of Organization 13. And of course, I am the 13th member. Or am I the 14th? The imaginary I member Shion. Anyway, most of you probably don't know what I'm referencing. So basically, what we're going to do this episode is we are going to discuss a topic I've wanted to discuss for a good while now. And it's something that I have brought up years and years ago in old videos that none of you have ever seen. And it's the topic of what I think of as emotional storytelling versus logical storytelling. Now, of course, over the course of the episode, it will become very clear what that means. Really, it will become clear in the next few minutes. But over the course of the episode, I think you'll really start to understand what this means and why I want to have this discussion. So basically, to me, emotional storytelling is the idea that you have something that is, let's say, what I think of as like, well, I don't think of it like this. It's called the rule of cool by many people. That's one form of emotional storytelling. Another form of emotional storytelling would be something like, let's say, a romantic plot line. Okay. And the two people who are in the romantic plot line, the romantic interests, or could be three, four, however many, let's just say that the characterization surrounding them, the plot surrounding it, doesn't entirely make a lot of sense. But because people just want to see this pairing, they don't really care. Even if there's not really a lot of logic to why they would get together or their characters don't really mesh, it doesn't seem like they'd actually like each other. Sometimes people just want to see a pairing so badly they do not care if it makes sense or not. The same thing can happen with happy endings. A lot of times people want a happy ending sometimes for certain stories or characters, even if it doesn't really make sense based on what preceded it. And of course, in the case of the rule of cool, you have a lot of tropes, technologies, different ideas, plot points, archetypes that people like in stories, even if it doesn't entirely make sense, just because it's cool. So, what I kind of wanted to discuss in this episode is how much as a writer or as a storyteller should you utilize emotional storytelling like the rule of cool or the type of romantic example I used, and how much should you not do that and be logical? Because some people might think, oh well, it doesn't matter, this is a stupid question, like you should always be logical. But the reality is that a lot of stories, a lot of people's favorite stories, a lot of people's favorite plot twists, characters, technology, tropes, it's based on things that don't actually make sense. And when you start to look into these things more, you realize that, yeah, this doesn't have a lot of logic behind it. But we don't care because it's cool. So, with that being said, Anthony, do you have any thoughts on this topic? Anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so this is definitely a broad topic. If we had more time, we could go in 100 different directions with this. Something to start off with is that while we're discussing this, every story has elements of both.
Mm-hmm.
Every story you have is going to have its own internal logic system that's going to try to follow as much as possible. And even the most logical, true to life stories are going to have some things that happen just for convenience, just for the emotional side of things. Two of my favorite books of all time are Les Miserables and The Count of Monte Cristo.
Mm-hmm.
And they both have the exact same criticism of these are amazing stories, super detailed stories, some of the best books written of all time. Both of them require so many convenient things to happen for the plot to progress, but that's just a natural part of storytelling. You
Mm-hmm.
have to fudge somewhere, you have to basically override the rules of reality and just say, oh, stuff coincidentally happens or this impossible thing happens, or else you're not going to actually have a story.
I've always found that to be interesting when people criticize a story and say something happens for plot convenience. Because a lot of the time, when I see that complaint, I'm kind of just like, well, how else is this? Like, I know what they mean. I know in the situations where it is blatantly just, you know, this was definitely just to move the plot forward. But a lot of times, people say, oh, like I've even seen some people be like, oh, they put this character through trauma just to develop them. I'm just like, well, should they just put them through trauma just for the sake of like I don't know. Sometimes, and speaking of emotive storytelling, I think sometimes it works in the opposite, which I think sometimes people have negative emotions and just want to dislike something. But yeah, I don't know. That just made me think of that as you were saying that. But yeah, sorry, go on if you have anything else to say.
No, I mean that's kind of my broad issue at the start.
Mm.
As you mentioned previously, this has been a passionate topic for you, so I'm interested to hear kind of where do you want to start off with? What's kind of your main drive for bringing up this topic?
Yeah, so basically, for the longest time, like I would listen to a lot of writers talk about, the craft and stuff, and I didn't really ever hear many of them, at least at the time when I was looking into this stuff. I didn't hear a lot of people bring up any concepts like this, and I'm not saying they haven't, it doesn't exist anywhere or no one's ever brought up. Because, like I said, you got things like the rule of cool, but outside of that, I didn't really, even with that, I didn't really see many people invoke that or talk about it as like very often, right? Um, and I found that peculiar because to me, that's one of the major things. Like you said, all stories pretty much on some level rely on it to some greater or lesser degree. Not necessarily the rule of cool, but just the emotional storytelling aspect. And that's really comes into like links into the whole notion of suspension of disbelief, right? Because in order for people to actually engage with fiction and to appreciate it and not think it's nonsense, you have to on some level suspend your disbelief. Um, and I think the emotional storytelling is part of that. But for example, when I would sit down and I would sit down to try and make my own stories, I would think a lot about this needs to make sense. This has to be logical. This has to, be grounded. If like I would be concerned that if anything in my stories didn't make perfect logical sense, people somewhere somehow would get like angry and just completely like destroy my book over it. But what I realized was, wait, hold on a minute. That's usually not what people like anyway. When people talk about stories and when we look at the things that most people enjoy, in the vast majority of instances, it's things that people have basically it's things that people are very emotionally attached to, right? There's a lot of emotion involved. And a lot of the examples I think of, and an entire genre really of media that I could, or an entire form of media that I would point to, is something like video games, which its entire function kind of relies a lot of the time on the idea of you not taking it too logically seriously, because in gameplay terms, there's a lot of things you're doing that doesn't necessarily coincide with the narrative, right? Like your characters taking multiple hits a lot of times, maybe, but they're not dying instantly. Yet in a cutscene, they'll die. There's actually an entire concept I've seen people talk about, which is like cutscene power levels versus gameplay power levels, right? So you've got characters who in cutscenes are either super strong or super weak, and then in gameplay wise, it's like the complete opposite, and so there's like a character could maybe like beat a boss in like 5 seconds in a cutscene, but then in the actual game, it's like it's a whole big thing, right? So that's a disconnect, but we allow that because it's cool. We enjoy the gameplay experience, so we don't care. But imagine if you was a developer, or you were sitting down, you was really thinking to yourself, oh, it needs to be super realistic. Now, I think with video games, you could probably see that's ridiculous, but I think it does also play into other mediums like books, where it's not as obvious that a similar type of disconnect does exist. You can have it where your characters, okay, like one of the examples I use, like romance. I feel like that's actually a lot more. Even though I don't read a lot of romances, I think that's a lot more of a common one than a lot of people might think. Because even in stories that are not romance stories, you have people who want to ship characters and things of that nature, and you have people who will really get emotional by it to the point where if they do not see certain ships come to fruition, they will be mad at the story. Like they will say the story's garbage, right? Because their ship didn't sail, I guess. Right? It wasn't a thing. So it's interesting because as a storyteller, this can be something that you can use, I think, greatly in your favor, right? But also you have to be kind of careful as well not to abuse it. Because at the end of the day, people do want the story to make logical sense, and they do want a sense of cohesion, and they do want it to follow, some semblance of logic. But I think that there's something to be said as well for the more emotional side, the fluffy side. And like I pointed out to you before we started the show, sci-fi has popular things in such as like FTL, which literally, every single person who knows anything about science will come and tell you that doesn't make sense, or time travel is not possible, even though there's always debates about whether it's possible or not. But there's all these concepts that like people will swear up and down does not make logical sense, or at least the way it's presented in a story doesn't make logical sense. But we don't care. In fact, one of the main genres that usually sidesteps this is like the zombie apocalypse genre. So many of those stories don't even tell you how it really began or why it exists or where it came from. It's just there, and there's zombies, and there was this plague. We don't know what is in the plague. We don't care, but it created zombies. So, and no one cares because it's zombies and they just like that. So that's just what it is. Um, but yeah, I think it's just interesting thinking about, like I say, how much of that you allow in your story. So, Anthony, how much would you say is a good amount for a writer to lean into the emotional storytelling versus the logical?
I think it entirely depends upon your genre.
Yeah.
Where, as you mentioned, if you are going into a sci-fi story or a romance story, you're looking for entirely different things than what you would expect to find in a historical fiction story, a slice of life story, a detective story. And so it does get a little bit awkward when you get into subgenres where, for instance, Star Wars relies a lot more on emotional storytelling compared to Star Trek,
Yeah.
where, especially in the early Star Trek episodes, they did try to go out of their way to try to make everything sound plausible, sound scientifically minded. And one of the criticisms of later Star Trek, modern Star Trek, has actually been that they put that on the back burner and moved it more towards emotional storytelling, try to make it Star Wars while not being Star Wars. But it is kind of just the genre dictates it, and also I would say the tone. I was thinking about my writing. There are parts where I am taking things super seriously, and in those chapters, I do try to be as logically minded as possible. And then I just have stupid, off the wall, fourth wall breaking chapters where if I was trying to take it seriously, there would be this emotional dissonance that people would notice. And so it's funny where you brought up video games earlier, where the first thing that came to mind was the whole debate around ludonarrative dissonance. This
Yeah.
was a huge thing with games media during the PS3, Xbox 360 era, where you had a lot of games come out that were trying to take storytelling seriously, but you had the super serious, super moral character come out of the cutscene and they just murder 500 people or something,
Yeah.
beat a woman or something, run over someone, run over a kid with a car or something. And so I'm glad we've moved away from that debate because there were games that tried to avoid the ludo narrative dissonance, and by so doing, they made their games boring. One of the chief examples of this, and that got critiqued a lot, was Red Dead Redemption 2, which for me, great game. One of my games of the year when it came out, but there is a lot of tediousness to it that if you stripped it out would have made it a better game for a lot of people. Now, some people enjoyed how true to life it was. A lot of people did not. And I think it's the same for storytelling in general, where if you go for that logical, true to life stuff, there's going to be some people who enjoy it. But you have to think about from the perspective of the average reader, the average consumer of your story.
Yeah, so see, this is what's interesting to me, right? Something you mentioned is to do with it being less fun in the case of Red Dead Redemption 2. And to me, when I think of the emotional storytelling, that's the main word I think of. It's why I often associate with the rule of cool, because it's the fun aspect. It's the like, that's really what it boils down to. Because if it wasn't fun, I don't think or if it wasn't satisfying in that type of way, then I don't think it would really matter. But that's basically what it comes down to. People want to experience stories, and depending, and I would say for most genres, and like you said, it depends on the genre. Because if they go to hard sci-fi, for example, they're not looking necessarily for that, right? There may be a bit of that they're looking for, but it's not going to be as much of a priority for that audience, because that audience specifically is looking for something that is very heavy on the logical side, very heavy on the factual side. Like they do not want a touch of Star Wars in there. Like, if you're gonna do some FTL, you better have actually somehow figured out to make FTL work, because otherwise that readership is going to destroy you. So, like, it depends on those types of things. They want to know all the nitty gritty. They want to know how the economy works. Like, it's funny. I don't know if there's a subgenre of fantasy that has a name that's the equivalent of hard sci-fi or not. Do you know if there is?
Um, I think that's where you get into the debate of like low fantasy and high fantasy.
Oh no, not this one.
Yeah. So that's a whole different debate that people can have. That's the closest thing I can think of. Then you get your people who like to discuss science fiction fantasy.
I have to ask you, okay, and I'm sorry, we're gonna go on a tangent now, but we have to do this because this is actually something I'm going to ask you before. What do you define as low fantasy and high fantasy?
So I come from it from a different perspective
Hmm.
where I was an English major. I've mentioned that before in this podcast. I would say the high fantasy and low fantasy is determined by the specific audience. And the thing that distinguishes them is one, how many fantasy elements are there? And two, how many fantasy elements are there? And just kind of how detailed, how focus is on the fantasy elements. Those are kind of intertwined, but to explain it further, I would consider A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, as most people know it, as low fantasy.
Yep.
Well, I would describe something Tolkien or C.S.
High.
Lewis as high fantasy.
You have no idea how vindicating that is. I had there was an entire debate that people were having me, and I say debate, but basically, so there was this one Discord server I was on, right? And every single this was years ago, every single person in that particular chat was telling me, and this was a writing server. There's lots of writers and people much older than me, more experienced apparently.
Mm-hmm.
They all told me that that definition was incorrect. They said to me that what low fantasy is and what high fantasy is determined by the setting. They said that if it is set in like an urban fantasy setting, that is low fantasy, and if it's set in a secondary world, it's high fantasy. My argument was, well, then why do we have the terms primary world
Mm-hmm.
and secondary world? That doesn't make sense to me. If we already have terms for to describe what you're describing, what do we have to describe a fantasy world with a lot of fantastical elements and a fantasy world that doesn't have a lot of fantastical elements? They didn't have any terms for that. So even if that was true, and even if it did mean the setting, I think it should be recontextualized for how you just described it, because we don't have any words for that, right? But that's the funny thing, because I never knew people had that definition,
Mm-hmm.
but apparently that's the original definition of it. Apparently.
So, so from what I understand, low fantasy and high fantasy, it's kind of offshoot of greater debates about literature, which was literature for the common folk and then literature for the educated, diligent reader.
Mhm.
So you had your low books and your high books. And to go even further, that comes from the debates between low church and high church, where your low church was your common church for the greater masses. Your high church was these are churches where you have to show up dressed in your pristine clothing. You usually have to have a thorough understanding to understand the debates and the lessons that were being taught. And so that's where the terms originally came from. It went from low church to high church, then low fiction to high fiction, and then that's how we got to low fantasy and high fantasy.
Damn. Okay. Thank you. I did not know that. See, educational. This is why the right cast is the right cast to be listening to. Okay, because you hear things like that. In all my time listening to people talk about these things, I never knew that. Never heard anyone bring that up. So that was very insightful. Thank you. Anyway,
And
I
I'm
know
not
that.
going to say I'm a total expert on this. My professor could have been making us stuff up for all I knew, but I'm just saying what I was taught.
Fair enough. Hey, it sounds like it makes sense to me. It's better. It's better. I've never seen anyone else give an explanation, so fair enough. But yeah, so I know that's an aside, but I had to bring it up because that's something that I've actually noticed as well. And even just that debate is just a funny thing in of itself, because again, I've told them that definition and the exact examples you used were the examples I used, and they said I've never seen anyone describe A Song of Ice and Fire as low fantasy, and I was like, what? So it made me think I was crazy Fast forward a couple years, I recently looked at that same server and saw people having that debate, and now a lot of people were saying what I was saying. So obviously, more people who have actually been taught something have gone in there. I guess I don't know. It's very interesting, and that's another thing that's very interesting is seeing the younger generation kind of start voicing their opinions and how so many of them clearly have learned similarly to me from like Brandon or something, and I can see it
Mhm.
because yeah, you can start seeing those types of things. Very, very interesting. But
Something
then,
that.
yeah,
Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead. No,
did
no,
you
go ahead.
want to finish your
No,
point?
no, no, no. It's fine.
I was just gonna tie it back in where it's been a huge shift in terms of fandom and the media that people engage in and what's popular or not. Where I popped onto the A Song of Ice and Fire about 3 months before it premiered on HBO, and it
Mhm.
was a good selling series. Like George R. R. Martin was making money off of it, but it didn't get the popularity it did until that show came out.
Mm,
And so I do think part of the debate and probably why some people were thinking it was high fantasy is because when it was out before the show, it was still a somewhat niche series. Still sold better than many other fantasy series, but a lot of people do kind of confuse this is niche, therefore it must be high fantasy.
mm. I don't. I'm not going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't think that's. I think they knew what they would. They knew. These people were pretty well versed in in some of that stuff. They genuinely was trying to tell me it's basically urban fantasy is low and. But anyway, it's a whole other point. But yeah, it goes to it's just something I think is interesting because even in regards to that, high fantasy and low fantasy, for example, like we was pointing out, low fantasy would probably like things like A Song of Ice and Fire, and really a lot of the grim dark fantasy in general. I think a lot of times people will say, "Oh, I like that." In fact, with Game of Thrones when it was out, it got a lot of people into that show, into fantasy, and a lot of people do who wouldn't ever watch something like Tolkien's works or like Lord of the Rings or whatever. They would watch Game of Thrones because they say it's more realistic. It's not so fantastical, it's not silly, and it's not too much magic. They can relate to it. In fact, when I would watch it, a lot of times the pacing of it would remind me, particularly with a lot of the like kind of just conversational scenes. A lot of times it would actually remind me of like a soap opera, not in a bad way, but it would just remind me of that in terms of like how it was paced and cut. I don't know, just reminded me of scenes that I'd seen in soap operas before. Um, which is quite interesting. And I think, like you're saying, in regards to genre, when you look at something like space operas, for example, versus hard sci-fi, we all know that space operas are definitely going to lean a lot more on the emotional side because it's more about fun. It's not to say that there's no logic in it. There is, but like you pointed out earlier, it's going to usually be a sort of in-universe logic that is basically being used to determine what makes sense and what doesn't. There's going to be like a technological system they've come up with. Again, like Star Wars, we have lightsabers. Okay. And even for people who know a bit more about Star Wars, you'll have things like these weapons that are made out of certain materials that can deflect a lightsaber, which you don't really see in the movies, but that's something that exists. And so it has its own logic, right? And even things like the Force and that kind of stuff. That's definitely not sci-fi. Even if they wanted to try and make it sci-fi midichlorians, okay. But either way, the presentation of it is very fantastical and magical. So that's something that a lot of people had to buy into and just enjoy and appreciate because it's emotional. In fact, that's actually a good example. When they tried to make that more logical, people got mad about it, right? Like a lot of people didn't like them taking the Force and trying to make that grounded and make it logical. They wanted it to be more of an emotive, airy fairy feely type of thing. They didn't want it to be grounded and rooted in logic. So that's even an interesting thing in the sense of sometimes people will see you trying to make something logical and say no, we don't want that, right? This also brings me to the whole discussion you have between with magic systems to do with what's considered hard magic systems and soft magic systems, right? And the idea that a hard magic system, is like an actual system. It follows a whole logical set of rules and everything makes sense. It's outlined versus soft magic, where a lot of times it's kind of more random. Maybe it's not as clear how it works. So I think that just in terms of these different techniques or methods, you start to see the contrast between emotional and logical storytelling. And whichever one you seem to favor more usually is going to, I guess, determine which one your story falls more into with the emotional logical side. Um, but yeah, there was a point I wanted to make. Damn, it's escaped me now. So, Anthony, do you have anything you want to say? Because it's a
Yeah,
good
so
point
I
as well.
think Star Wars is a perfect case study that everyone should follow because when it comes to your emotional versus logical storytelling, once you find your middle ground, you're kind of stuck. Whereas you mentioned midichlorians, stupid idea. No one liked it. It went way too logical and was one of the biggest complaints about the prequels. Now we just had the sequel trilogy come out, and we saw the exact opposite happen, where they tried to lean even more into the emotional storytelling to the point that it bothered a lot of people. We were making fun of this before we started our episode, but once
Mhm.
again, episode 9, both of us absolutely hate it. And one of the worst parts of that movie is Palpatine. I was super excited when they announced that Palpatine was coming back, but when they announced he was coming back, I was expecting them to do something to explain why he was coming back. And they didn't. They just figured, well, it's going to be cool if we have him back. So that's all the effort they're going to put into it. And it hurt the movie for it. So, again, I'd be really interested if you know of an example or if someone who's watching this knows of an example of a series that started off as either a logical or emotional storytelling, got popular, and then somehow managed to make the pivot into something else. Because I can't think of any good examples right now.
Hmm. Make the pivot. So it started off as either logical or emotional.
Yeah, it found its middle ground. So, like, Star Wars has a good identity. Every time it tries to pivot, it doesn't go well. Star Trek has a good identity. Modern Star Trek is a lot more emotional than old Star Trek, and a lot of people dislike it for that reason. So, can you think of an example where something found its identity, pivoted into something else, and people still liked it?
Hmm. Not at the moment, but I think because that's. I mean, when you say people still like it, I'm sure there's people who still like
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek, right? Like despite the
Yep.
fact it's changed. But I guess if you mean like where there's barely any complaints, I don't think that's possible because I could be wrong, but I think you'd that'd be very, very, very hard to do because your initial audience and the people who are going to be with you to that point where you're switching, they would have had to have been invested based off of how it originally was. So for you to make a shift that significant, there'd have to be some in-universe reason to explain it. For example, like let's say you started off with a fantasy series where, or I say fantasy, but let's say you started off with a series, whatever it would be defined as, where there was no magic, and then you returned magic to the world, and then once you did that, now there was, you know, more magic. Maybe. I'm trying to think of I don't know. I can't think of anything. I can think of things that got crazier throughout the story,
Mm-hmm.
but the thing is that that's not the same because the story already was crazy
Yep.
at the beginning. So it's not. Yeah, I can't really think of any where it's like people had no issue with it over time. And I think it's because it's too significant of a shift. Your best bet. I would actually say if you know that, let's say like what I just said, you're gonna have no magic at the start or something, and you know you're gonna bring that back and by bringing it back, it would completely shift the tone of the setting because now there'd be fantasy elements and magical elements. Let's say it was originally like low fantasy, like Game of Thrones. In fact, Game of Thrones kind of did it a little bit, but not really, but a little bit. But it just wasn't that extreme. But the magical elements started creeping in a bit more as they got further into the show. But I think that Eh, yeah, it's hard to do. You'd have to still have that stuff there, basically. You'd have to foreshadow that the magic is there, that those types of things are there, that the emotional side is there, or the logical side is there, so that when you go into it more later on, people aren't entirely blindsided. You know what I mean? Because the problem is that usually those attract different types of people. So if you attract people who want the super again like hard sci-fi, let's say you had a hard sci-fi story, and as time went on, like you're saying, with Star Trek, it becomes softer there might be people who specifically like Star Trek and don't like Star Wars because Star Trek is more grounded in reality, is more logical, is more on the this is how the tech works type of side, and they don't like Star Wars because it isn't like that. You're going to now lose those people because you're basically becoming what Star Wars is. right? When the main thing that distinguished you from it was that you didn't, you wasn't doing the same thing. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I think it's hard to pull that off though, like in the way you're asking. I'm not really sure how someone would do it. No, I don't have an example.
Yeah, I tried to Google search it while you were discussing this, and I couldn't find anything. Like there was a couple examples where they try to say some sitcoms became more serious over time, but I don't necessarily count that.
Mm,
It's
yeah.
also I struggle where if it's like a TV series where TV series just change tone all the time, especially because you have so many different writers and directors involved.
You know what? Something I'm kind of thinking of a little bit is Battlestar
Mhm.
Galactica. Not entirely, not entirely, but a bit. I don't know if you've ever
Mhm.
watched it. You ever
I
watched it?
haven't.
Okay, it's actually a very good show. I watched it when I was 16. Um, it's a very, very good show. But I feel like Battlestar Galactica
Mhm.
kind of does this a little bit, but not entirely, because you see, that's the thing. It hinted and was always kind of presenting things as something extra. It's not just sci-fi.
Mhm.
There's a more mystical side. There's a religious aspect, and that was throughout all the seasons of the show. So when you got further into the show and more kind of mystical, kinds of things happened, like is this an angel or blah blah blah. Like when things like that come into the show, it's not that shocking. Um, and the because so much of that stuff was in the early parts, so it's just that it becomes a bit more so. But I did see criticism against the show for that, for the fact that they leaned into that a bit more as time went on. But it's very interesting. I don't know. I think again, like I say, in order, if I'm sitting down with a storyteller, for me, if I'm thinking about this, I want to make the balance be there. I want to make sure that this is something that people can actually be happy with or open to, so it doesn't blindside them. So you'd have to foreshadow it in some regard. Like I don't want to say too much things that will ruin whatever I'm making, but um, for example, in fact, I'll use an example of something I've heard about. I won't even name it, but there's a story out there where where in the setting, right, all the characters is a fantasy story, and they have a currency in the setting, and it turns out that the currency they're using is actually parts of a spaceship. Okay, so there you go. That's something where it's like, what is this? And then as time would go on, you'd realize, oh, this story isn't actually fantasy in a way I thought. It's kind of sci-fi. So that's something where that might annoy people, because they might be like, well, I thought it was a fantasy story, and now I'm finding out sci-fi. I don't like this. There was a YA fantasy book that I heard about a few years ago, where in the second book of the series, it was a book where they had all these dragons, and what happened was they discovered the dragons were made technologically. People were upset about that. Not everyone, but a good number of people. So it's kind of hard to do those things. I think to an extent, you kind of have to just accept, if you go down one side more than the other, more logical, more emotional, and you really heavily go into it, you have to just accept that people might feel some type of way. So, like, for example, when I use the romances, if you're just going to give people the ship at the end, okay, there might be a portion of your fan base who's like, no, I don't like that you ended with that romance, because that made logical sense. I don't care if people wanted to see that ship. They shouldn't have got together, right? And I do think that when it comes to conclusive things like endings and final pairings and relationships and character deaths and stuff like that, or reviving a character, personally, I do think you should lean a bit more on the logical side, because those are going to be emotional events anyway. You know what I mean, Anthony? Are you gonna say?
I'm trying. I don't want to spoil this, but uh, Xenoblade Chronicles is just coming to mind while you're
Oh no,
mentioning
do
all
not
this.
spoil it, because I want to play
Yeah,
the Xenoblade
it's
game.
just they do something so freaking funny that also just made everyone happy. I
Mhm.
I can't even say it because I can't say the writing advice is do X because it doesn't work for 95% of the stories out there.
But
It's
let's
just
let's discuss that then, without having to go into specifics about Xenoblade.
yeah.
But why do you think it is that it can work sometimes though? Like in the example like we were talking about.
Mhm. I mean, that example worked because everyone got what they wanted.
Okay, that's
You
pretty
can't
much it.
give everyone what they want in most stories without either breaking a social taboo or taking extensive amount of time to set something up. Like again, Xenoblade, it comes off as a joke. So again, I wouldn't use as an example, but now it gets me thinking where it's like, how much prep work do you need to put into a story when it's emotionally based versus logically based? Because I feel like if it's emotionally based, you can pull something out of left field like Xenoblade does and please everyone in your audience. Whereas with a logic based story, it either comes off really well or it absolutely collapses in on itself.
Yeah, and that's another thing is that some stories attract audiences where they will forgive the emotional things because the nature of the story is something where the audience has been conditioned or is kind of there for that. Because it's funny you say that. I've not played Xenoblade, but for some reason I get somewhat Kingdom Hearts vibes from it. And not saying exactly the same, but I feel like Kingdom Hearts, in a similar sense, kind of relies a lot on the emotional side of storytelling and the rule of cool, especially. So there's a lot of things where it can just get away with something, and it's like that doesn't make sense. And in a lot of other fandoms, they would not allow that to be a thing. But you can get away with it in Kingdom Hearts because, oh, it's Kingdom Hearts. This is the game with Donald and Goofy and Mickey Mouse in it. So who cares, right? And I think that depending on that, like you similarly to what you brought up, because of how your audience may be, you may get away with it more with a certain type of story than another. So if you know your audience is the type, you've somehow cultivated an audience where they will let you get away with pulling out emotional nonsense just because it'll make them happy, then fair enough. You know what I mean? This is also another thing that's quite interesting, just as a small note. This is actually an advantage other mediums have over books, especially mediums that can use visual storytelling and music. Because with books, for you to pull off that type of emotional storytelling and not have people think it's nonsense, your writing needs to be very convincing. Whereas, and all you have is your words. See, like with a movie or a video game, you can like hit people with the music and the cut scenes, the voice acting, and people can be like, oh, it's and then they get in their feelings, right? But with writing, you have none of that to support you. You just have words, so it better come across strong because you do not have like these majestic orchestras, and because a lot of times that's what sells people on things. Like especially I think like again if I go to Kingdom Hearts, and I think a lot of JRPGs actually they get away with sometimes a lot of things because anime as well gets with a lot of things because the music kicks in at that moment and the choreography, and there's some really cool badass scene where someone just smashes through a window and they do this little twirl and they throw their sword in the air and it lands perfectly, and they had like it just all comes together too perfect. So it's like, damn it doesn't make sense, but I'm hype. that's something that visual stuff can get away with. In books, you can do that, but you gotta write that well. You gotta know how to write, like you gotta do that well. You don't have any of those things to support you. So I think that's another thing to think about if you are going to be on the more emotional side as a writer, specifically in like a book or a short story or anything. You gotta just remember you do not have the advantages or those other elements to support you.
Yeah, it's interesting where there are actually some writers I know who will write the audiobook version first before they even think about how their novel's going to turn out because they have that added support of just having a voice read it out loud provides emotional depth that you don't get by just reading it in your mind.
Yes. There's so many. It's true. There's books I have literally listened to an audiobook, and I'm like, I don't know if I would have liked this book the same if I didn't have the audio. Because if I liked the narrator, there's times where the narrator made me laugh. In fact, even, and this is just things you can't really account for, but even my experience when I play, because never listened to audiobook on 1 time speed or 1.5 a lot of the time. So if I'm listening to it like 1.7 or something, or 2 or 2.5, right? Sometimes certain parts of the writing comes out funnier because of that. And I probably would not love, and I've gone and listened to certain passages again in like slower speeds. I'm like, that was not the same. That didn't hit as the same way. That was boring. But when I listen to it on the faster speed, it's like, ha, that delivery was funny because it's like, and it just makes it sound funny, right? So it actually changes my emotional engagement with the story just because of how I'm experiencing it through something that no one that created it has any control over. So that's another funny thing as well, is that sometimes people might like your work for reasons completely out of your control, even in like just life situations, right? But that's not something you can control. So there's not much to really say about that. I just thought it was an interesting point to make. There was a point I really did want to make, and I still, for some reason, cannot remember it, and it's annoying me. But the main thing, really, anyway, is to do with how when you take these different emotional elements, okay, and you're piecing together a narrative, and you start asking yourself the question of, okay, so you know, I have this character and they're dead, and I know people want them back, but it doesn't make sense for me to do this. I think like what you have to kind of ask yourself, and this is something I guess I'd ask you, Anthony, as well. In a situation like that, do you think that okay, fan service is basically what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Fan service, right, is like the ultimate form of emotional storytelling. Now, there's things like Spider-Man, right, which recently, released a film which was fan service out the wazoo. But personally, I love that film, and a lot of people love that film. And I have to say, out of a lot of the things that Marvel's released lately, it seems to be one of the things that most people have a more generally positive consensus of that was in Phase 4. So, in certain situations, doing things that's emotional, even though it did follow logic and it did make a certain degree of sense, it's just funny how. I guess what I'm trying to say is, how much would you say? How much? I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this. When there's a top like a character, I'm thinking of a character being revived or brought back specifically. Would you say it's good to do that if it will make the audience happy, even if you as the author don't think it makes sense? So this isn't necessarily the same as whether or not it's logical in the story or not.
Mhm.
You as the author just specifically may not think it makes a lot of sense or is very good, but you know the emotions it will bring out in the audience will make them happy. So it's kind of like a kind of like debate between doing what you know is right as the author. I don't want to say you know is right, but you know what I mean. What you want to do, your will, versus what your audience wants, because it'll make them happy.
So, I mean, number one thing I would say is never ever do something just because it'll make your audience happy. That is a surefire way to destroy your story. And there's hundreds of examples that show you what happens if you pivot your plan at the last second, just do something just because you think your audience will like it more. We even brought up Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker, bringing back Palpatine just because they knew it would make the fans happy was not the right decision for that movie. But in terms of the overall debate about fan service, I think fan service in general is actually good. I think that more stories can use more fan service. Where
Mm-hmm.
I always think about the missed opportunities, where it's like, I really wish I wanted this character to interact with that character. I
Yep.
really wish that these characters fought. I really wish that this character got to learn about that. But for me, my approach to storytelling has always been everything you do, there's going to be a consequence. So when you make a decision, you have to think about what are the good things that'll happen because of this, what are the bad things that happen because of this, and if you're a great storyteller, you're going to think about how can you capitalize on this moment of fan service to turn it into something more than just fan service. Because
Yes.
again, there's a lot of things that are included because they're fan service, but are also included because they're critical pillars of the story. So I think that's just trying to find the balance of the two of making something cool, but also making it matter beyond the coolness.
Yeah. And I would say, when in regards to that thing, just in general, in terms of balancing, I think if you do it like in maybe 70-30, 80-20, maybe 80-20 is best, but basically where the majority of it is logical, people are going to give you more allowances when you have lapses in logic, because they're going to say, well, for the most part, this makes sense. For the most part, they obviously know how to construct a narrative that follows some form of logic. So if there's some lapses, this is the reason why a lot of people overlook or excuse plot holes, right? Because it's like, okay, that doesn't really make sense. It's kind of stupid, but you know what? Who cares? Most of it makes sense, so it is what it is. And honestly, that's something that when you are sitting down as a storyteller to create something, it's really good to remind yourself of that. Because as I said earlier, when I was starting out, I would always overthink the idea of making things like perfectly logical. And I had to remember and pay attention to the fact that most of the things out there are not like that. Everything, for the most part, even if I remember, like, I would just Google things that I loved and just put like plot holes, or things like this. My favorite game of all time, Knights of the Republic 2, is constantly considered an unfinished game, which it is unfinished technically, which is insane to me that it's unfinished and still destroys so much other Star Wars stories. That's crazy. But you know, that is so insane. But the fact of the matter is that it's not perfect, right? And nothing is. So even if something's unfinished or has holes in it, or it doesn't entirely follow logic or sense, or there's something missing, or this could have been done a bit better, people will give allowances if they feel like, you know what, that was still kind of cool, or you know what, that wasn't cool and I didn't like that, but I'll allow it because I like mostly everything else, right? So I'm not saying that you should want bad things for people to not like things, but I'm just saying that you can't control how everyone's going to react to everything, and you may have an idea that you think is cool or you think will work, and it turns out maybe a sizable portion of people don't like it, but they might be okay with not liking that one thing because they like them. I mean, look how, again, we're talking about midichlorians, but at the end of the day, people still showed up for those prequel films anyway. At the end of the day, right? They still pushed those movies up, still made them a lot of money. Star Wars is still this massive franchise that is pretty much everyone knows. So midichlorians was not enough to stop that. No matter how much people disliked it, young Anakin and the Clone Wars not actually being in the films and all these other criticisms that people can throw out there and say that made the prequels trash was not enough to stop them from still loving Star Wars. Even the sequels were not enough to stop people from still loving Star Wars. The Kenobi show. Yeah, I know some people don't want to hear that. But even the Kenobi show, Book of Boba, I'll stop. But the point is that no matter what, some franchises have so much goodwill with people that it takes a lot for people to not like them. So I think that the more goodwill you build up with your audience, the more allowances they will have with you have lapses in logic. But for the most part, I don't think you should be wanting to deliberately create things that don't make sense. Um, Again, unless you're trying to use the rule of cool or something. And in regards to that, you just have to know how to use it. You have to recognize, okay, this doesn't make sense, but it's really cool and people are gonna like it. Like, okay, I have a character who has this giant sword that they carry around, even though there is no way this person could possibly hold this thing. But no one's gonna care because it's cool. And sometimes I will say this, just as a final thought, when it comes to things being cool, a lot of times, sometimes the safer option is to just not explain it. Because when you start trying to explain it, that's usually when you're gonna let the criticism in. Because now you're trying to make it logical, and when you do that, now people are gonna have something to say. They're gonna start criticizing the logic. Whereas if you just don't say anything, no one can criticize it. Again, this goes back to the whole thing with the Force. When it's just the Force and there's no real logic to it, everyone loves it. No one can criticize it because you're not trying to say there's a system or it follows this kind of theory or anything like that. The moment you try and ground it, now people are going to start treating it like as if it's an actual scientific thing and we're going to evaluate it and cross-reference. And, I don't know how you cross-reference midichlorians, but, that's basically what people do. But, yeah, do you have any final thoughts, Anthony, you'd like to say on this?
Yeah, so the only final point I would have, we've covered so many different things in this conversation. But the one helpful bit of advice I would give is that no matter what genre you're writing in, no matter what type of story you want to tell, you need to make it so that it feels like you're not wasting your audience's time. You need to make it so that every part of the story matters. The reason why the Palpatine thing was so stupid is because it negated the entire struggle of 6 previous movies.
Yes.
And that's going to be true for the rule of cool. That's going to be true for emotional versus logical storytelling. You just have to remember your audience has so many better things that they could be doing with their time, but they decide to give you a bit of their time. So don't waste it and make every part of your story count, whether you're trying to be funny, whether you're trying to do something cool, whether you're trying to do something sad. You have to ask yourself, should I cut this or not? And if I'm not cutting it, why does it need to stay in?
Yeah, that is very, very solid advice, I would say. And that is it for this episode. So take away what you can from it. Definitely think about everything we've said, okay? And try to make your story as emotional or as logical as you like. And of course, if you have any of your own thoughts or any of your own opinions you'd like to share on it with us, let us know in the comments below. But that is all from us. So thank you very much for listening, guys. And thank you for watching. And we're out. Peace.
Yep.